It's my pleasure to introduce Nehal Nayak, who is a PhD student at Brown University and has done a bunch of interesting work about adapting foundation models to end tasks, including some synthetic data generation that he'll talk to us about today, among other things. So take it away, Nehal.
Thanks for the introduction. And let me just share my screen. This. Right, can you see this?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. Great. Thanks for the introduction again. And yeah, today I'll be presenting my work on data-centric approaches to adapting foundation models. Foundation models are the backbone of every intelligence system that's out there. It's an umbrella term for large language models, vision language models, speech-to-text models, and more. We know that they've done a lot of great things in the recent years. Just in the last few weeks, there have been so many exciting developments like OpenAI's O3 model and DeepSeek R1. But we know that these models are not perfect. When the term foundation models was coined, we were promised that all we had to do was adapt these models to our tasks and it would address many of our problems, almost magically. But today we know that's not the case. Adapting foundation models itself is a challenge. To create a strong foundation model, you typically need several stages of complicated training strategies, which makes them less flexible and harder to adapt to our tasks. Take large language models, for instance. They undergo several stages of training. First comes pre-training, then supervised fine-tuning with instructions, followed by reinforcement learning with human feedback. And despite that, they won't perform well out of the box on every task. So we need a way to adapt it. To adapt it, first you need a lot of compute. And let's assume you have the compute. You also need high-quality label data for your tasks, which is very expensive to obtain in specialized domains. Later in this presentation, I will share how much expert annotators get paid. And suppose you don't have high quality label data and you just have unlabeled data, simply fine tuning on it might undo multiple stages of training and hurt performance. All these are new problems. This raises an important question. Are we toast? Not quite. That's exactly what my work addresses. In my work, I introduce data-centric solutions to adapt foundation models to your tasks. And what's cool about my work is that I focus on adapting foundation models to new tasks without human annotations. In the first part of my talk, I will show you how to use unlabeled data to generate synthetic data sets in specialized domains to adapt large language models without human annotations. In the second part, I will show you how learning to identify objects by composing concepts enables vision language models to efficiently generalize to new unseen compositions without additional human annotations. Then I will show you the limitations of existing vision language models to generalize to compositions with multiple objects. These two topics, synthetic data sets and composable concepts, are part of my broader vision on generalization. I want to build machine learning models and systems that can generalize to new tasks without annotations. This area of research is typically called zero-shot generalization or simply generalization these days. In some of my earlier works, before foundation models were popular, I introduced frameworks to create zero-shot models with knowledge graphs, and then integrated that into a weakly supervised framework for DARPA. I also played a key role in developing instruction-tuned models like T0 and created important data sets like P3. I've also played a key role in releasing pre-training toolkits for academic settings and contributed to the development of pre-trained models like Bloom. On 4 projects where I've been the lead author, my GitHub repositories have received about 1,000 stars, and my models have been downloaded tens of thousands of times. Overall, my projects have received 4,000 stars, and my models and datasets have been downloaded a few million times. Now, these numbers are just to indicate that my work has had significant impact on the community. With that, let's go back to the main themes of our talk: synthetic data sets and composition. First up, synthetic data sets. I'm contractually obligated to say that LLMs are cool. You can take a single sentence, the capital of France is, and pass it to the large language model, and it'll generate the next token and complete it. You can even ask a complicated question like this one. The question here is asking about the role of mitochondria in remodeling plant leaves during programmed cell death. Now, this is a challenging question that only an expert might be able to answer. In fact, there is a growing need to create specialized LLMs that can answer such highly technical questions. Professionals from areas such as legal, finance, healthcare, and even scientists want to use LLMs in their work. Existing LLMs are trained to be general so that they can serve a wide range of use cases. The data used to train these models comes from sources such as Wikipedia pages and newspapers. It's a one-size-fits-all approach. In contrast, we want our LLMs to do well in domains like medicine and law, where the data is highly specialized, often requiring implicit domain knowledge. And it's no secret that these general purpose language models don't perform well in every specialized domain. They still lag behind in performance when compared to specialized LLMs. And even if the biggest language model companies like Google, Anthropic, or OpenAI came out with their fancy API-based models with improved performance in specialized domains, we might not benefit from it. This is because people cannot share their data with other organizations, as it might break privacy regulations and even breach contracts. Some examples of such data include electronic health records, legal documents, and private research data. So, how can we adapt large language models to specialized domains? The first thought everyone has is, can we adapt large language models with self-supervision? This idea was introduced by this very group a few years ago. The idea is super elegant. Just continue training with the LLM with the pre-training objective, such as next token prediction on the target corpus, and you'll get the domain adapted model. It's pretty cool. But this approach requires a lot of compute and is resource inefficient. Plus, I will show you that with instruction models, this approach will lead to catastrophic forgetting. Alternatively, you can adapt LLMs using instruction tuning. The best performing models continue training the large language model with instructions from specialized domains. Some successful examples include MedPalm in the medical domain, Scirif in the scientific domain, Climate GPT in the climate domain. But collecting instructions in specialized domains is very expensive because these instructions are annotated by human experts. For example, the creators of GPQA paid as high as $150 per hour for annotations from experts. And there is no easy workaround. Climate GPT tried to use non-expert annotators to create instructions from academic research papers and technical reports. But they quickly found out that their annotators struggled with these documents. So they ended up changing their documents to something more simple. So far, we have two possible choices: self-supervision and supervised learning. Both have their pros and cons. While self-supervision offers low data cost, meaning we don't have to annotate data, it is computationally expensive and provides no explicit instructions. On the other hand, we have supervised learning, like instruction tuning, that can create high-quality models, but collecting training data sets is very expensive. This raises the question, is there a middle ground between these two approaches? Can we achieve low data cost while still developing a high-quality model? And that's exactly what I do. I created Bonito, an open source model that converts users' unannotated text from specialized domains into synthetic instruction tuning datasets. I'll now show you how simple the workflow is. First, we have the train Bonito model. I will explain how the training procedure works in a few slides. Then we have the unannotated text from the target domain. Here I'm showing you an example of a soccer player Walcott scoring a hat trick in a soccer match. Say we have the target task, say natural language inference. We pass those two to the Bonito model and it will generate the instruction response pair. The model generated a question. Just ask if Walcott scored 3 goals in the match. Now it understood that hat trick and 3 goals mean the same thing and asked an interesting question. Later in the presentation, I will show you a case study with PubMed where the generation is even more impressive. And after generating sufficient examples, we can train the model on the data set to get a specialized model. At this point, you might be wondering, how does Bonito learn to generate tasks? Our key idea is to create meta templates that will generate the data set which will be used to train Bonito. Consider this data set. This data set has, from Hugging Face, this data set has columns like question, answer, and passage. The way instruction tuning data sets are constructed is by defining Jinja templates. Prior to this work, we created a repository for prompts called P3 or prompt source, where we annotated multiple Jinja templates for several data sets. In this Jinja template, we have the input and the output and the columns from the data set. Now, in this work, we identified all the Jinja templates from P3 that reason over a passage or a context. And here's the cool part. We remix the Jinja templates to create the meta template. In the meta template, we have the passage and the task type in the input and the instruction response pair in the output. We also have a placeholder for the context so as to not repeat the passage. We repeated this process for 323 templates and 38 datasets. Once we have the meta template, we can replace the columns in the template to create the training examples. With this approach, we generated 1.6 million training examples. We call this dataset the conditional task generation with attributes dataset. We trained Mistral 7B with supervised fine-tuning to create the Bonito model. Obviously, you can use any model of your choice, but a year ago, Mistral 7B was one of the best models with Apache 2 license. We also released another model with Llama 3.1 as the base model. All right, now let's look at a case study with PubMed. I'm going to take an abstract from PubMed along with the target task type, which is yes, no question answering, and pass it to the Bonito model. Let's see what Bonito generates. As you can see, Bonito generates an instruction response pair. Let's analyze this generation a little bit more. The highlighted portion is the instruction with the question. This says, having read that, is LPPLA2 mass and activity levels associated with acute brain ischemia? Now, this is something a subject matter expert might be interested in. Now, let's try to answer this question. The first sentence highlighted in green seems to contain some of the words that we are looking for. Now, this is a really complicated sentence, but it says that they studied the relationship between LPPLA2 mass and activity levels and acute brain ischemia. But it doesn't really tell us if there is an association or not. The answer is actually in the final sentence. The sentence basically says that LPPLA2 mass and activity levels are not associated with acute brain ischemia. Now, there was no mention of acute brain ischemia in the final sentence, but there was mention of ischemic etiology. And what's cool is that Bonito combined elements from the two key parts of the paragraph highlighted in green to generate a challenging question and also the correct answer. All we had to do was provide the paragraph with the task type. In our experiments, we considered 3 task types: yes, no question answering, extractive QA, and natural language inference. We considered a total of 7 datasets from domains such as PubMed, privacy policies, contracts, social media, and more. We're interested in a task called zero-shot task adaptation, where we have access only to the unannotated text from these datasets and a target task type. With an appropriate learning method, we will then adapt a target model to this data set without human annotated training data. We consider two baselines or supervision sources. First one is none, which is the zero-shot performance. And the second one is TAPT, which stands for Task Adaptive Pre-Training. This is a self-supervised baseline. This baseline is from the Don't Stop Pre-Training paper at a task level. In this work, since we consider decoder-only models, our self-supervised learning objective is next token prediction. We adapt the Mistral 7B to the target tasks using only unannotated data. Of course, in the paper, there's lots more models. Here I'm going to show you results averaged across all the data sets. The columns represent the different methods, and the y-axis is the performance averaged across all the data sets. The zero-shot pre-trained model gets a performance of 27.6 points. After training with self-supervision, the same model improves performance by 4.4 F1 points. Now, training with Bonito-generated instructions improves the zero-shot model performance by 39.1 F1 points, which is significantly higher than the self-supervised baseline. To achieve such high performance, we only use synthetic data sets generated by Bonito. No manual annotation was necessary. Now let's look at a more practical setting where we want to adapt an instruction model to the target task. We create an instruction-tuned model by training Mistral 7B with instructions from P3. We will now adapt this model with self-supervision and Bonito-generated tasks. Here are the results. First, we find that instruction tuning improves model performance on average and performs reasonably well on specialized data sets. Now, this is where things get interesting. We find that self-supervision reduces performance by 0.8 F1 points on average. Some data sets reduce more than others. This is because self-supervision interferes with instruction tuning and leads to catastrophic forgetting of the instruction following, which hurts the model's performance. This is an important result because prior work only adapts pre-trained models with self-supervision to specialized domains. In 2025, most people don't start with a pre-trained model. They typically start by adapting an instruction-tuned model because it performs so much better compared to a pre-trained model. On the other hand, we see that Bonito improves performance by an average of 15.1 F1 points. We don't see issues like catastrophic forgetting because our data is formatted as instructions. We released an easy-to-use package on GitHub. We also included tutorials as well as quantized models. So check it out. And also, we have released our model weights on Hugging Face. The downloads have been holding steady despite being out for almost a year now. The work has been very impactful in industry. People have written blogs on how to use this for their work. And also, it has featured in industry technical reports alongside Microsoft's flagship agentic framework on synthetic data generation. To summarize, building specialized large language models is and is going to be an important problem. Creating synthetic datasets in specialized domains is a good approach as it offers a favorable trade-off between performance and cost. In this work, I showed you that synthetic datasets can indeed improve the performance of both pre-trained as well as instruction-tuned models in specialized domains. Right. So far, I've shown you how to adapt foundation models with synthetic datasets. But that's not the only way to do it. Now, I will show you how compositions can help in adapting vision language models. Similar to large language models, we can use vision language models for zero-shot inference. Here's a picture of a cat. You can pass it to the vision language model, and it will tell you this is a cat. Clip, by far, is the most popular vision language model that can work out of the box. Here's the architecture of Clip. We can write prompts in English, a photo of cat, a photo of dog, and it gets mapped to the token embeddings, just like in a language model, and we pass it to the text encoder. This will give us the text representations for cat and dog. We can do the same thing with the image and pass it to the vision encoder to get the image representation. Finally, we take the cosine similarity between the text and the image representation and choose the class with the highest cosine similarity as our prediction. It's that simple. Here's a picture of a cat, and Clip can accurately tell that this is a cat. Creating this cat in a dog classifier did not require any additional training. All we had to do was just write a prompt for cat and dog and just classify it. But obviously, there are deficiencies in this model. We tested Clip on fine-grained datasets, and it doesn't really perform well. For example, here's a picture of a small dog, and Clip thinks this is Sunny Cloud. Here's a picture of blue jeans, and Clip thinks this is a blonde skater. It's plausible that this could be a blonde skater, but looking at the image, I don't see one. So we need to figure out how to improve Clip on fine-grained object classification. Consider this list of fine-grained classes. We can decompose this into their constituent attributes and objects. Say we have 25,000 classes, which we get by taking the Cartesian product of the attributes and objects. In traditional machine learning, we would have to collect labeled examples for 25,000 classes. Collecting labeled examples for such a large number of classes takes both time and effort, and we don't want to do that. Instead, we teach Clip how to compose concepts, meaning we collect labeled data for a subset of the classes or compositions, say 1,000, and then we generalize to the rest of the 24,000 compositions without additional supervision. This idea both saves time and the cost of annotating data. Now let's try to adapt this model. We could naively fine-tune Clip on the training dataset, but this would require us updating both the text and the vision encoder. This approach requires a lot of compute and meticulous hyperparameter tuning. This is where our method, compositional soft prompting, comes into picture, or CSP. We have the prompts for the fine-grained classes, old tiger and young cat. We also have the corresponding token embeddings for the attributes and objects. And here's what's cool about our method. We only learn the attribute and the object token embeddings. We plug these learnable embeddings into the prompt, which are called as soft prompts. And then we use the same pipeline as before and compute the cosine similarity between the image and the prompts. Finally, we calculate the loss and backpropagate to only update the weights of the token embeddings. Our approach modularizes soft prompts, which allows us to recompose them during inference in the same way. For instance, we recompose the fine-tuned embeddings to get the soft prompts for young tiger and old cat, and we can predict it the same way in the same pipeline. We experiment on 3 data sets that contains classes defined by attributes and objects. These data sets are called popular in the compositional zero-shot learning literature. First one is MIT states, which contains the everyday objects like ripe and unripe tomato. The second one is UT Zappos, which contains different types of shoes. And then the last one is CGQA, which is a large-scale data set containing everyday objects. In our experiment, we will be training the model on the subset of the compositions and then evaluate them on held-out compositions. Right. We consider 2 important baselines. First one is Clip, and the second one is co-op. Co-op is analogous to prompt tuning in NLP. We have the same prompt as before, but here we learn a single prefix soft prompt and plug that into this prompt. All right, let's look at the results. Now here's the results. On the x-axis, we have the different data sets, and on the y-axis, we have the performance. As you can see that CSP outperforms our baselines on all 3 data sets. The key difference between CSP and co-op is that CSP is modular. We suspect that learning multiple prompt compositions is the main reason for improved performance. CSP has several other advantages because of the modular nature of the prompts and the flexible text encoder. One of the advantages is generalization to higher order compositions or compositions with more complexity. In our training set, we have compositions such as young cat. Can we automatically extend it to small young cat without any additional training? Our results on a newly annotated data set shows that CSP significantly improves unseen accuracy compared to the baselines. Now, this is something that had not been explored before our paper. Researchers had developed task-specific architectures for attribute object compositions and couldn't really extend to higher order compositions without modifying their architecture. This work has been very impactful in the compositional zero-shot learning literature. It is the default baseline to compare in the literature. But wait, there's more. But first, water break. All right, there's more. So far, we've seen single object compositions such as small cat. But since we are in this compositionality framework, we can study a lot more interesting questions. One interesting question is that does this data-centric approach always work? Will the model continue to generalize to different types of compositions, especially involving multiple objects? Now, I will show you that this data-centric approach may not always generalize to new compositions. Right. Now we are going to study two object compositions and relational compositions. The two object compositions could be something like small cat and pink flower, and the relational compositions can be something like cat left a flower. Among these three types of compositions, the two object and the relational settings require concept binding. It means that we want the model to encode multiple objects and correctly attribute the features to the objects or bind the features to the objects. For example, in the two object setting, we say small binds cat and pink binds flower. But why should we care about these compositions? I'm going to motivate this problem with an example. I prompted ChatGPT to generate an image of a red sphere to the right of a green cube. The model generated the exact opposite. Now, this isn't a complicated image to generate, but here ChatGPT trivially fails. The issue could be that the underlying representations cannot encode the compositions that require binding or concept binding. And when you train the models like diffusion models using these representations, they will continue to fail. This is an important requirement for practical applications. For this reason, we need a systematic way to evaluate these representations. Existing compositionality benchmarks have issues. For example, consider this ARO benchmark. This is a compositionality benchmark which includes real-world images. It has true labels like horse eating the grass, as well as distractors such as grass eating the horse. Now, in this case, it is checking if CLIP can understand the order of objects. If the representation is only learning a bag of words representations, it will fail. But here's the issue. It doesn't really test the vision part of the vision language model. Suppose you black out the image, you can take a large language model and choose the answer based on the perplexity, and you can get a really high score on this benchmark. This motivates the need for a more controlled environment to evaluate CLIP. To systematically study this problem in a control setup, we created a new dataset called the concept binding benchmark. This is a synthetic benchmark created using Blender designed to study different types of compositions. Obviously, credit to my co-authors, Martha Lewis from University of Amsterdam and Ellie Pavlik from Brown, who helped us create this dataset. In this dataset, we have three different settings: single object, two object, and relational. Since this is a synthetic benchmark, we have the flexibility to curate the correct as well as the incorrect labels. Let me walk you through this. In the single object setting, we have one correct label and four randomly sampled negative labels. In the two object setting, we have the correct label, yellow sphere, and we have four negative labels, out of which two are considered hard negatives. Our model should not confuse yellow sphere with gray sphere or yellow cube. The reason these are called hard negatives is because we don't want the attribute yellow and gray to bind to the wrong objects. And just a spoiler, this is exactly what ends up happening. In the relational setting, we have the correct label, cube left of cylinder, and we also have 4 distractors, out of which 2 of them are hard negatives. Our model should not confuse cube left of cylinder with cube right of cylinder and cylinder left of cube. Right. In each data set, we have 3 splits, train, validation, and the generalization classes. All of them have disjoint classes. So we train the model on the train classes and then use the validation accuracy to choose the best performing model and report the accuracy on the generalization split. Here I will be showing you performance on the train and the generalization split. Let's look at the results. On the x-axis, we have different methods, and on the y-axis, we have accuracies for the different splits, train and generalization accuracy. So far, we are seeing like both models, CLIP and CSP, are doing pretty well. It's looking good. But this is where things get interesting. In the 2-object setting, there is a significant drop in performance across both CLIP and CSP. No model gets significantly above the random baseline on the generalization split. After doing some error analysis, we found that there are 2 types of errors that dominated. First one is that the model got confused by the adjective type. And in the second one, the model got confused by the noun type. The performance in the relational setting is even worse. Both CSP and CLIP get close to 0 on the generalization split. We did some error analysis on the error patterns and found that 2 types of errors again dominated. In the first one, the model got confused by the order of the objects. And in the second one, the model got confused by the relation type. So what does this all mean? This result indicates that representations might not be rich enough to encode compositions that require concept binding. This could be potentially caused by the fact that there are separate encoders for the language and the image inputs, and training with additional data doesn't really teach the model to generalize to new compositions. This is an important limitation to keep in mind. This work has also been very impactful. People have extended our findings to diffusion models and found that diffusion models also suffer from such limitations. In summary, I showed you that learning to identify objects by composing concepts allows us to efficiently generalize to new compositions without additional annotations. Then I also showed you that current vision language models do not generalize to compositions that require concept binding. Right. So far, I've shown you data-centric approaches to adapting foundation models. In my future work, I want to focus on improving workflows in intelligence systems. Let me motivate my future work with an example. Let's look at the newly released AI2 Open Scholar system. Here's a simplified view of the system. Scientists can ask the system a question. The system uses a combination of a retriever and a language model to generate the output. There are a lot more cooler things happening within this system, like self-correction and re-ranking, but for now, let's stick to this view. Now, let's ask it about the latest RLHF algorithms. What are the differences between DPO, KTO, and ORPO? And this is what the system generated. Let me walk you through the generation. First, the system understands the query from a very challenging domain. Then it retrieves multiple documents with citations. After that, it combines multiple documents into a coherent synthesis. This is pretty cool and useful, but there are some issues that we have to deal with. The system can hallucinate. For example, the citation for Yang et al. Is incorrect. Yang et al. Introduces a paper called ROPO and not ORPO, it stands for weight-oriented preference optimization. In fact, there is no mention of the phrase orthogonal preference optimization in the paper. The correct citation for ORPO, or the correct ORPO, stands for odds ratio preference optimization from Hong et al. I know the difference is very subtle between ROPO and ORPO, but a scientific model should understand these intricate details and refuse to produce generations instead of hallucinating. Finally, the correctness of the entire generation is still unknown. Yes, there are citations, but are there more issues? Does the explanation have to be more precise? Should I be reading one paragraph more carefully than others? I don't know. The problems I've described here are not just limited to building scientific systems. These are fundamental problems that everyone building an intelligent systems for their task is facing. By addressing these fundamental problems, we will not only build a better system for scientific discovery, but also address major pain points in the community. To address these problems, I'll propose data-centric solutions. First, I want to create a better foundation model for scientific understanding. My key idea here is to use background knowledge to create better synthetic tasks for training large language models. Then I plan to create an expert in the loop evaluation framework. My key idea here is to get natural language feedback from experts and then convert them into labeling rules. With these two solutions, I hope to create an improved systems for scientists to understand literature. All right, let's start with the first project on creating better foundation models for science. There's a lack of multi-document instruction tuning datasets. Folks who created OpenScholar recognized this problem and created synthetic datasets using unlabeled data from scientific domains. They use Pesto, which is also from AI2. On a high level, this is what their synthetic dataset creation pipeline looks like. You sample an abstract and use a large language model to generate the synthetic information seeking question. Then you use the same intelligence system to generate the response. And with this, you have the synthetic instruction response pair. But this approach has some issues. First, the synthetic questions are generated with only one abstract. It might generate a question that is too general. An expert might be interested in asking more precise questions about multiple papers. For example, they might want to know the differences between DPO, KTO, and ORPO instead of a more general question like an overview of alignment algorithms. Second, even though the system retrieves citations, it can be hard to verify if the citations are referring to the same concept in the synthetic question. For example, it was very hard for us to verify if ORPO and ROPO mean the same thing, even if the citations were present. My idea to improve synthetic task generation process is by providing additional background knowledge. Instead of generating synthetic question with just one abstract, we sample k additional abstracts that are similar and use that information. Now, additional background abstracts could help us craft more precise questions. Then it will also be easier for us to validate synthetic tasks because we can use additional background documents to verify if the retrieved citations match. If they don't match, we can refuse to produce generation for that concept and say that we could not find that exact reference. With this pipeline, we can potentially create a better synthetic data set for training large language models. Based on a similar motivation and idea, we recently won an NSF grant at Brown to create large language models that can understand climate science literature and assist scientists. My prior work on synthetic data generation with Bonito played a key role in us securing this funding. All right. Now that we have a brand new system with an improved language model, the bottleneck is evaluation with subject matter experts. As we know that evaluating with experts is both expensive and time consuming. To address this problem, I want to create a new expert in the loop evaluation framework. My key idea here is to get natural language feedback from experts and convert them into general labeling rules, which can be scalably applied to test instances with large language models. Let me walk you through this idea in more detail. Suppose we have the same generation as before. We can divide this generation into multiple paragraphs. And using an off-the-shelf hallucination detection model, we can identify paragraphs with low confidence or high uncertainty. And once we've identified the paragraph, we can pass it to the experts and get their feedback on it. Once we get their feedback, here it would be the model generated explanation for ROPO instead of ORPO. We can then distill this down to a general rule in natural language. Then we can use this rule as a prompt and run this prompt using a large language models on all the paragraphs to see which one breaks the rule. We repeat this process with more experts and more paragraphs till we exhaust our labeling budget. This process will give us a table with annotations with different rules, as which one breaks the rules, which one obeys the rules, etc. Basically, it will give us a label matrix. But here we have to deal with some corner cases. For example, what happens when one annotator says paragraph does not follow rule 1 and the other says does not follow rule 2? Who's correct, expert 1 or expert 2? How do we address this label conflict? To address this problem, we can use tools from weak supervision. I won't go into too much detail, but at a high level, the idea is to treat the ground truth as a latent variable and use a probabilistic model to estimate the accuracies of the expert annotators, and then weight that information to determine the final label. In my work, I've used weak supervision to resolve label conflicts with multiple supervision sources, such as zero-shot models, few-shot models, and semi-supervised models, and we submitted this system to DARPA. All right. Once we've resolved label conflicts, we can then compute an aggregated score for the system and complete the evaluation. We can even use these labels from experts and iteratively improve the system. There's lots of possibilities and opportunities for future work. To summarize, in my future work, I would like to use background knowledge to improve synthetic tasks to create better language models. And then I would like to create an evaluation framework that accepts natural language as feedback. Evaluation framework that accepts natural language feedback from experts and converts them into labeling rules to scalably evaluate these systems. Right. I'd like to thank my collaborators from Brown, University of Amsterdam, Cohere, Wisconsin, Cornell, Tübingen, and ASAP, where I interned. I also want to acknowledge all the funding agencies who supported my work. And with that, I'll conclude my presentation on data-centric approaches to adapting foundation models. Thank you. Right. Questions?
Thank you, Nihal. So we have, a lot of time for questions.
Perfect.
While people are thinking, maybe I'll ask a small one. So going back to the first part of the talk, you showed how task adaptive pre-training can hurt the performance of an instruction model. I guess I wondered if you tried the other order. So instead of starting with, so the first set of experiments you showed were like just on a base model, and the second were on an instruction tune. So I wondered about a different order of the second set of experiments where you first do the task adaptive thing and then instruction tune on top of that. Does that work any better?
Yeah, I did try that. It doesn't work any better. In the performance, are you talking about this? No, not this result. Yes, I tried that experiment and it didn't really work. Like that's actually a very good idea. We tried that, didn't really work. Because what happens is the instruction tuning data sets are from like a more general domain, and we excluded any data set that we were going to use as the target data set. So in P3, we did not have any specialized domain data sets.
Okay, and then one more question, and I think I don't understand. Like, I hesitate to ask this question. I'll just make it fast. I think there's some results that you can actually do weight arithmetic as a proxy for the actual instruction tuning. And so if you looked at like the delta in weight space between the base model and the instruction tuned one, you could actually post apply that same delta to the task adaptive model. Does this sound familiar at all? And,
yes.
Okay.
We also tried that idea. Obviously, we didn't publish it because we found that this approach performs better than the weight using model arithmetic.
Okay, cool. All right, thanks. Those were my small questions. Questions from the rest
No,
of...
great questions. Thank you. Sorry, I cannot read the chat. Can someone read the chat?
Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, I enjoyed the talk. I especially think that the expert in the loop stuff is exciting, and like the idea of creating labeling rules, which has been studied like in the crowdsourcing literature.
Right.
Just wondering what your thoughts are on creating generalizable rules. You sort of showed like annotators looking at one example and then coming up with a generalizable rule. Just wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way I was thinking, so I was thinking of coming up with a generalizable rule using a language model rather than asking the experts to come up with a generalizable rule. It will be a lot more burden for the experts to come up with a more general rule. So I think we could potentially experiment with a few shot prompting to convert a more specific rule into a more general rule. We really have to experiment that part, but that's how I was thinking it. And what else could we try? Like, I think just few shot prompting makes sense. Did you have any thoughts in particular that you were thinking of?
I have a lot of thoughts on this, but I was just curious what your like how do you think you would identify generalizable rules?
Yeah, I think I would use prompts, and potentially what could happen is we might get like redundant, like similar looking generalizable rule. Like that could be because we are using a language model to create these generalizable rule. So in that case, what we can do is we could potentially cluster similar looking general rules into like one bucket, and then give the same label to all the rules that are in the same cluster. And that way we could minimize some of the redundancy label as well. Plus, in using the weak supervision framework, people have also looked at identifying correlations between the labels or weak labelers, where they sort of discard labels if they're redundant. And that's something that has been explored in the weak supervision literature before. So those are some ways we could potentially mitigate some issues that I foresee.
Thanks.
I have a very small question about the second part of the talk, the concept composition. So I'm not familiar very much with some of these image tagging data sets, but I noticed that some of the attributes you were looking at were, something like pink, sort of correspond to similar features across, sort of every image. You could classify pink in a way separately from whatever it corresponds to.
Yes.
Whereas other concepts like old would be different if you applied them to, a person. You might look for wrinkles, versus a computer. You might look for something else. Did you see examples like that? And was the model maybe challenged by those ones that don't have a...
Yeah, let me actually show you an example. So in this, here, do you see that there is old tiger and young cat? Like hypothetically, you can even create a deflated dog, which isn't, a real world concept. You can have it, but not really. So in that case, what we had to do was, in our experiment setup, we have two settings. One is all the real world concepts that are possible. And in the other setting, we had like all possible combinations. So in that case, what we use a language model, more like word embeddings, to identify unfeasible concepts of infeasible concepts and just zero out those logits when we were predicting, when we were finally predicting. So that's one way to resolve that issue. Did that answer your question, or?
Well, so, I mean, I guess my question wasn't so much about certain concepts being infeasible, right? So yeah, like a deflated dog doesn't make much sense as a concept, but old, I'm thinking, can apply to different concepts in different ways, right? So the way that a human becomes old is different from the way that a computer becomes old, or the way that a tree becomes old, for example.
No.
So you'd be looking for different image features in those cases. It seems like it would seem difficult to come up with an embedding that you could.
No, you're absolutely right. So what we hope this approach does is it will disentangle the compositions and learn a more like disentangled feature representation for the attribute old. So that's what we are hoping. And because we are training this on lots of compositions of old tiger, old cat, etc., we hope that it can learn to identify like a more generalizable composition for old, like a representation for old.
I see. And sorry, just to be clear, so when you train this, were you also updating the weights of the vision model itself, or just the language portion?
Just the language, just these embeddings. Like,
okay,
if our data set had like 100 attributes and 250 objects, just that many 350 embeddings. That's it.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think maybe I'm next. Thank you again. Really great, very, very exciting talk. Cool work. Also like your vision going forward. Obviously you went through that very, very quickly. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about it, in particular about how you would generate better synthetic training data to do scientific language models. You outlined an approach there, but I didn't quite catch how it compares to the synthetic training data that was used to fine-tune the model in the Open Scholar system.
Yeah, at least from what I've read in the paper, Pesto, the Open Scholar system samples just one abstract and generates an information-seeking question, and then uses the same Open Scholar system to generate a response for the synthetic question, and then uses that as the synthetic instruction response pair. In my approach, what I want to do is I want to take the same abstract, this one abstract that we sampled, and then possibly take like k nearest neighbor of related abstracts or even documents, and then you provide that as additional background abstracts in the context when generating this initial synthetic question. And once we have an initial synthetic question, we can then use the same pipeline as before, and then generate the synthetic tasks. And now it will be easier for us to verify if some of the concepts generated in the synthetic question that we are asking about are the same or not. So this is sort of an extension of the synthetic data set that Open Scholar already has, but with an additional feature of like refusing to generate, or like refusing to generate the output if it finds that something is retrieved incorrectly.
Great, thanks. I think we could talk about this for hours and hours.
Yeah.
And exciting to do so, but I'll stop right now. Thanks.
Thank you.
I had one other question, I guess, about the vision model. So that those embeddings that you're training, how exactly are they? Well, I guess I'm curious how they're trained. So if you have a picture of a green sphere and a blue cube. So the two attributes on that are green and blue. Does the attribute embedding get updated with those two labels, like blue and green? And it's sort of, so it sees a green sphere and a blue cube as an example of both blue and green. But that decision or that training signal is entirely independent of which object the attribute is applied to.
Are you asking this question in case of two objects, or?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. That's a good question. So so in our data set we test for both. So there are two sets of labels for this example. So for one of the labels we test is yellow sphere, and the other one will be gray cube. And we have appropriate distractors for those as well.
Got it. So yeah, I guess if I'm understanding the architecture correctly, like these embeddings are independent. And so, like, unless there were distributional information, like most spheres tended to be yellow, then I guess we really wouldn't expect the model to be able to assign an attribute to the object just by the nature of the model, because these things are like trained independently.
So I think even if they're trained independently, what do you mean by trained independently?
Well, I mean, I guess this is an example of both gray and yellow, right? And that's
Right.
all that the attribute model sees, is this thing's gray and yellow. Like it has, right? And so I'm wondering, is that correct? Like, is it actually true that the attribute embedding sees this as an example of yellow and gray, and that's all? And then there's a shape embedding that sees this as an example of cube and sphere, and that's a separate model. And these have independent parameters.
Right. So both the attributes and the objects have separate parameters, but because we are in this CLIP framework or CLIP model, both of them get encoded with the text encoder, basically, which is a transformer. And what we hope will happen is the models will learn to disentangle these compositions and learn a feature representation for yellow that can be applied to a new type of object at test time. And also we are training feature embeddings for the objects as well. So there is a lot of mix and match happening at
okay, great. Yeah, I think I was assuming a simpler model. So thanks. That's very helpful.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I guess there may have been other questions, but I guess we're out of time. We should let people go. Thanks very much, Nihal, for the great talk.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. Let me just close my.
Great job. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay, I'll stop sharing my screen. Thank you.